Hello everyone, this is Mabadofu and it's time for some Jank techs. Today we finally delve into Commander Legends. We're going to be going over 3 of the jankiest decks I could find using the new Legends that might actually be good enough to win a game. Keep in mind these aren't going to be full deck lists, think of them more as outlines for how to build the decks. But before we get to those, let's go through some of our honorable mentions. These are decks that didn't quite make the cut but might have a little bit of potential. Starting off we have Arden. The idea behind this deck was you play equipment that gives you benefits, and then attach them to your opponent's creatures with Arden. Then, if your opponent attacks with that creature, you still get the benefit because you own the equipment. For example, you could give your opponent's creature a Sword of Fire and Ice, and then you would get to deal 2 damage and draw a card if that creature hits somebody, because you still own the sword. The main problem here is that this deck is probably too janky to actually work. You need to make sure your opponent attacks, so you would have to include goat effects or something, and it just seems like way too much work for too little payoff. Our next honorable mention is Anara and Falthus. The idea here was to get both of your commanders on the board and then play lure effects to force your opponents to block. I checked the rules and I'm 99% sure that if you have a creature with menace and your opponent has to block, then it forces them to block with 2 creatures. The main reason we ditched this deck idea was that it honestly just didn't seem quite janky enough. The deck was pretty straightforward and I couldn't find a way to really give it that unique feel. Next up we have Radiant Serra Archangel. I really tried to make this one work, but it's too hard to justify running a 7 mana commander that just taps your flying creatures to give her protection. I thought about making a deck that rewards you for tapping your own creatures by running cards like Throne of the God Pharaoh or creatures with Inspire, but you would still have to make all of your creatures fly for this to work. There are just much easier ways to build a tap your own creatures deck, so we ended up scrapping this one. Our last honorable mention is Elena Kessick Trapper. The idea for this Jank deck was to make her deck almost creatureless and rely on different strategies to use her ability. The first idea was to steal our opponent's creatures on the turn they entered the battlefield. This will still work for Elena because the creatures entered that turn and we control it. We could also try to play artifacts and then change them into big power creatures with something like Karn to get a lot of mana on our turn. This honestly might work, but I didn't think there was quite enough support for it. So with those out of the way, let's get to our 3 janky Commander Legends decks. First off, we have Amaryth the Lustrous. I was a little disappointed at first when I saw this card revealed because it felt kinda generic and boring. You just fill your deck with a bunch of artifacts or enchantments or creatures, and then draw a card whenever you play a card. But then I had an idea. What if we made all of our permanents into every permanent type? Then we would be guaranteed to draw a card every time a permanent entered the battlefield. We can run cards like Enchanted Evening, Mycosynth Lattice, March of the Machines, Opal Essence, Nature's Revolt, and Nashaya. If we get enough of these out, then all of our permanents will be enchantment artifact creature lands, and we can start drawing cards like crazy. This deck actually has a decent amount of support, because you can do some pretty powerful things when you mess with permanent types like this. Darksteel Forge can make all of your permanents indestructible if they're all artifacts, and Terra Eternal can do the same thing if all of your permanents are lands. You can use Aura Thief when Enchanted Evening is out to gain control of every permanent on the battlefield. If you want to be a little mean, you can use board wipes that destroy all things of a certain type that your opponents control. Cards like Boom Pile and Planar Outburst won't hit any of your permanents if you make them all into lands, and Cleansing Meditation can wipe out your opponents if you make all permanents into enchantments, but you'll get everything back if you have Threshold. There is even some combo potential here. Archon of Sun's Grace goes infinite if the Pexus tokens you make are also enchantments. Alright, now on to the next deck. This deck isn't necessarily super janky as a whole, but I included it anyway because I think it might be the funniest use of commanders I've seen. The deck is built around Essior and Rograk. As soon as I saw Rograk, I knew there had to be a janky way to build around him. Just attacking with him was too simple, and even using him for 0 mana creature combos didn't quite seem janky enough. And then finally I realized his purpose. Rograk is the perfect commander for a polymorph deck. As soon as you get to 4 mana, you can just play him and polymorph him away to get a Blightsteel Colossus. Essior is here as backup. We can polymorph him too since he's only 2 mana, but he can also protect our Rograk from instant speed removal if someone tries to kill him in response to our polymorph. Now I know polymorph decks have been done before, so that part of the deck isn't super janky, but I just couldn't help but enjoy the fact that Rograk has 3 abilities on him and we're ignoring all of them and just using him as a 0 mana body to trade for something better. Our last deck was quite the challenge. As soon as this commander got revealed, I knew I wanted to build a deck around him, and I also knew that it was going to be really tough to find a way to make it work. I am, of course, talking about the Prismatic Piper. I've hardly seen anyone else even mention this commander. Usually they just say, oh, it's for draft, and move on. And honestly, they're right. This commander was designed for draft, not constructed.
I don't think it has much relevance outside of draft, although who knows? I guess maybe there's some partner pairing that would take advantage of it.
That's right, Seth. There was someone crazy enough to build this deck, and that person was me. This deck went through multiple revisions until I finally found something I was happy with. Let's take a brief look at some of the previous iterations of this deck. So at first, I thought the only way I could justify running Prismatic Piper as my commander was if I found a way to build around his color changing ability. My first idea was to run cards like Spreading Plague to help destroy our opponent's creatures. So here's the game plan. You build a deck with Prismatic Piper and any black partner, and then you only put in black cards. That way, you can let the Piper be any color you want. When the game starts, you look at your opponent's commanders and you pick the most common color among them for your Piper. For example, if you're facing 3 green decks, you name green. Now when you eventually get your Spreading Plague down, you can play Prismatic Piper to blow up most of your opponent's creatures. Now this technically would work, but there was only one problem. I could not find a single other card like Spreading Plague. I looked and looked, but I couldn't find any other plausible benefit to making your Prismatic Piper match your opponent's deck colors, so we had to scrap that idea. For my next idea, we went real deep. What if we play a Happily Ever After deck? We partner the Piper up with a Shy so our deck can be white and blue. Now in order to win with Happily Ever After, you need permanents of every color, so we can use mind control effects to steal red, green, and black permanents to pull this off. The Piper can act as a failsafe in case one of the colors is missing from the table. So if we start a game and we see that nobody else has a deck with red in it, then we can make our Piper red in order to fill that gap. This also would technically work, but holy cow, this deck would be bad. This wouldn't really qualify as a janky deck because I don't think something this bad even counts as a deck in the first place. I was a little bit disappointed with these decks, and I also did some rule sleuthing, but I was never able to figure out if you're actually allowed to look at your opponent's commanders before you decide what color your Piper is. So there was a chance that this idea wouldn't even work anyway. So after 2 failed attempts, I decided to take one last shot. I gave up on the color changing ability and tried to think of anything else that makes this commander unique. And that's when it hit me. The Prismatic Piper is the only commander that you can cast without any colored mana. That's what we had to build around. Now there is one exception, because Rograk doesn't require any colored mana either, but I decided to build a Bant deck so I couldn't use Rograk here. So this deck is built around the Prismatic Piper and Kydel. The entire goal of the deck is to use Kydel to get infinite colorless mana, and then win the game by casting the Prismatic Piper infinite times. This deck idea seemed a bit too janky at first, but after looking through some of the cards, I think this might actually be a decently good deck. In order to pull off our combo, there are 3 things we need. First, we need to draw some cards to make Kydel tap for 4-ish mana. We draw 1 card per turn, so we can just use a Brainstorm or something to get that going. Once we have that down, we need to find a way to untap Kydel using just colorless mana. There are a lot of ways to do this, but the main 2 I want to focus on are Sword of the Perrons and Umbra Mantle. They both let us untap Kydel for 3 colorless mana, so as long as she's tapping for at least 4, we can get infinite colorless mana this way. Once we have that down, all we need is a way to sacrifice the Prismatic Piper and a way to get value from him. Sometimes we can do both parts with 1 card. Something like Carnage Altar, Altar of Dementia, or Blasting Station will let us sack the Piper and get value until we eventually win. My favorite option is Mortar Pod, because it lets us sack the Piper for damage and it's also an equipment. That's where making the Piper white brings this deck together. We can pull off this combo mostly just using equipment, and white is the best color at tutoring equipment out. We have cards like Stoneforge Mystic, Quest for the Holy Relic, Steel Shaper's Gift, and Open the Armory to help us tutor out our last equipment we need for the combo. Since equipment are also artifacts, artifact tutors like Tezzeret the Seeker, Reshape, Fabricate, and Enlighten Tutor can help fill the gaps. We probably don't need all of these tutors, so just pick the favorite ones you want to put in the deck, and that should be good. I think this deck will have a pretty heavy artifact theme, so we can use some more artifacts as backup combo pieces. We can use Basalt Monolith and Rings of Brighthearth as a backup to Kaidel for infinite colorless mana. And Demon Mail Hauberk works as a backup equipment that actually is a sack outlet. The rules here are a little confusing, but you can equip the Demon Mail Hauberk by sacrificing the creature you're trying to equip it to, so it's kind of just a sack outlet. If we already have infinite colorless mana and a sack outlet, then there are some backup value generators too. Aetherflux Reservoir will win us the game if we just cast our Piper enough times. This next one is my personal favorite. If we have infinite colorless mana and a sack outlet already on the board, we can play the Prismatic Piper and then sacrifice him and choose to let him stay in the graveyard. Then we can use Molten Tail Masticore to exile him from the graveyard and deal 4 damage to someone, and then have him go back to the command zone instead of staying in exile. After looking through all the cards for this deck, I think it'll actually be pretty solid. Blue has always been great with artifacts, and white has a lot of equipment support, so if we make enough of our combo pieces equipment, it should work pretty well. But let's be real, nothing will be more satisfying than winning a game of Commander using a creature that was only meant for draft, and also by making him the worst Commander color, and then casting him infinite times. And the best part is, the Prismatic Piper is the only creature that can do this. It is the only partner commander that can be white and not cost any colored mana to cast. I love this deck so much that I'm probably actually going to build it in paper. I'll make sure and do a follow-up video and tell you guys how it went when I actually build the deck. Anyways, that's it for our Commander Legends Jank text. Thanks for checking out the video and hit subscribe if you want to see more.